Welcome. I'd like to welcome our distinguished panel of witnesses for joining us today. Very glad to have you. In his very first inaugural address, President Thomas Jefferson defined good government as one that shall restrain men from injuring one another and shall leave them otherwise free to regulate their own pursuits of industry and improvement. This pro-liberty standard, embraced by our founding fathers and the Constitution, has served us well. Today, the United States stands as the most powerful and prosperous nation in history, a beacon of hope to people throughout the world. But there is a growing sense among many that our nation is in decline. We have now seen years of sluggish economic growth, stagnant household income, the largest percentage of Americans not working since 1977. Far too many people who've simply given up any hope of having a job, of starting a business, of having a future. Entrepreneurship, truly one of America's defining traits, is hurting badly. It is a tough time to own a small business in America today. The last several decades have seen a dramatic decline in the rate of business formation. Business deaths now outpace business births. That is a deeply troubling trend in our nation. One that stands in direct opposition to the promise of America as a land where anyone can start with nothing and achieve anything. And on top of that, the United States now ranks 46th in the world when it comes to the ease of starting a new business. 46th. That's hard to imagine. Why is that? What's gone wrong? We're here today to discuss a major part of the problem: government overregulation. It is axiomatic that the larger and more intrusive government becomes, the smaller and more docile we the people are forced to become. There is no greater obstacle to growth, to opportunity and prosperity for all Americans than an invasive and bloated government. Ronald Reagan understood this. It is no coincidence, he said, that our present troubles parallel and are proportionate to the intervention and intrusion in the lives that result from unnecessary and excessive growth of government. The federal government, and sadly many states, no longer adhere to the Jeffersonian standard of leaving the people free to regulate their own pursuits of industry and improvement. Instead, they now seemingly regulate everything under the sun. 55 years ago, there were 13 regulatory federal government agencies. Today, there are over 70. 55 years ago, the Code of Federal Regulations contained 23,000 pages, a sizable amount. Today, the Code of Federal Regulations takes up an astounding 175,000 pages and 235 volumes, all in incredibly small print. Somehow the American people are expected to comply with 175,000 pages of regulations that no one person can even begin to understand. This figure dwarfs the number of statutes actually enacted by Congress, the body that the Constitution entrusted with making our laws. Federal statutes today take up over 40 volumes and 50,000 pages, about a quarter the length of the federal regulations. Although an inexact science, estimates of federal regulations are estimated to increase costs up to possibly $2 trillion a year. Is it any wonder we have the economic stagnation, so many millions hurting, when the federal government is putting $2 trillion a year of cost on small businesses, on those trying to create jobs and opportunity? And unfortunately, the media far too often writes off overregulation as a trifling issue because they believe it only concerns giant corporations, not everyday people. This hearing is about shining the light on the true people paying the price for government overregulation. Truth be told, overregulation harms everyone, but it especially harms those who don't have the resources or political connections to get a special exemption, to have a lobbyist, to get a favor from government. And far too often, those are minorities. African Americans, Hispanics, single moms, people who are struggling but want to start a small business, want to stand on their own feet, want to provide for their family. And the burden of federal regulation makes it harder and harder and harder to do exactly that. Peter Kurzanow is the longest-serving member of the United States Civil Rights Commission. He's an African American, and at a hearing very much like this held 20 years ago, Commissioner Kurzanow said this: regulations affect all businesses, but they have a particularly pernicious effect on small businesses, on businesses that are marginally capitalized, are labor-intensive, or are perceived as being credit risks. A disproportionate share of those businesses are owned by minorities and by Black Americans. Unfortunately, 20 years later, overregulation remains and has become an even bigger obstacle to the success and prosperity of those who are struggling to achieve the American dream. Revenues for minority-owned small businesses still, unfortunately, lag behind revenues for non-minority-owned businesses. And yet, minority-owned businesses must absorb regulatory costs of roughly $7,000 to $10,000 per employee, just like any other small business. What this means is that regulatory costs have a more severe impact on the bottom line of minority businesses than other businesses, making it more difficult for minority businesses to grow and hire more employees. The regulation epidemic in this country certainly hasn't translated into more jobs and prosperity for minorities, especially since President Obama has taken office. The median household income for African Americans and Hispanics, for instance, has remained virtually unchanged since President Obama was elected, meaning that there has been no recovery since the 2008 crash. And poverty rates for African Americans have gone up. African American unemployment remains almost double that of non-minorities, as it has for over 50 years. And there are together roughly 1 million fewer working-age African Americans and Hispanics employed today than when the president took office. Let me repeat that statistic. There are together roughly 1 million fewer working-age African Americans and Hispanics employed today than when the president took office. That's roughly 1 million lives impacted, plus their children, plus their families. People who want to work, want to provide for their families, and yet are being denied that opportunity. It's estimated that for every additional $1 million that the government spends enforcing its regulations, the economy loses 420 private sector jobs. Of course, it doesn't have to be this way. Curbing excessive government regulation shouldn't be a partisan issue. We should be able to find a way to stem the tide of red tape, to loosen the burdens on small businesses that are struggling to create opportunities, without weakening essential protections for our society. Not all regulations are bad. but a wall of regulations descending from Washington on small businesses and crushing job creation is making it harder and harder for people who are struggling to achieve the American dream. I want to thank each of you for being here, and I look forward to your testimony. We have today 7 witnesses. The first witness, Mr. Michael Barrera, a Kansas City-based attorney with over 30 years of business, legal, nonprofit, and government experience. A graduate of Kansas State and the Texas Law School, he serves as the National Economic Prosperity Manager for the Libre Institute, a nonprofit that promotes economic freedom in the U.S. Hispanic community. Before joining Libre, Mr. Barrera served as the president and CEO of the U.S. Hispanic Chamber of Commerce, and prior to that, as the National Ombudsman for the U.S. Small Business Administration. Our second witness is Amit Narang, an expert on the federal regulatory process, a graduate of the University of Pennsylvania and the American University, Washington College of Law. Mr. Narang is a regulatory policy advocate for Public Citizen, a nonprofit public interest organization founded by Ralph Nader. Timothy Sandifer is an Arizona-based attorney who specializes in economic liberty and constitutional law. A graduate of Hillsdale College and Chapman Law School, Mr. Sandifer currently serves as the principal attorney for the Pacific Legal Foundation, where he is the lead attorney in the PLF's Economic Liberty Project. William Scott is the CEO of Tri-States LLC, a community and economic development consulting company in Selma, Alabama. Educated at Alabama State University and Troy University Montgomery, Mr. Scott is a former mayor and council member of the town of Mossas, Alabama, and a veteran of the United States Army. Thank you, Mr. Scott, for your service. Sabrina Loving is a Chicago-based small business owner, a graduate of Robert Morris College and Roosevelt University. Ms. Loving runs Loving Tax Services Incorporated, a tax preparation service she started 5 years ago to assist individual and small business clients with their tax returns. Aaron Mayer is the 57th president of the Sierra Club, one of the nation's premier environmental organizations. He became a member in 1999 and has held numerous leadership positions within the organization since 2002. And Henry Alford is a DC-based business leader, a former Wisconsin football player and Army officer. Thank you for your service as well. Mr. Alford currently serves as president and CEO of the National Black Chamber of Commerce, which he founded with his wife Kay over 20 years ago. Prior to founding NBCC, Mr. Alford worked for several Fortune 100 companies. We'll now have an opening statement from Mr. Coons.
Thank you, Chairman Cruz, and thank you for calling this hearing. The foundational principle underlying this hearing, that regulations are inherently harmful to business and our prosperity, I think is highly dubious. A previous Senate Judiciary Committee hearing in this very Congress examined this point, and evidence presented by the OMB suggests that major federal regulations have a net benefit to our economy of between 130 and 800 billion measured over 10 years. That shouldn't be surprising because since 1981, every economically significant regulation is required to undergo a searching cost-benefit analysis before being put into effect. Rulemaking is also governed by the APA, the Administrative Procedures Act, which guarantees all stakeholders the opportunity to be heard, and courts have not been shy about striking down regulations that run afoul of rulemaking procedures or organic statutes, as evidenced by the court's decision last term in Michigan versus EPA. Turning, though, to the precise topic of today's hearing, the impact of regulations on racial minorities, I would observe that the argument against regulation is too narrowly focused on looking at the acute costs of regulation and not sufficiently focused on the wide-ranging benefits of regulating some private behavior to minimize injustice and to diffuse externalities. The Civil Rights Act of 1964, for example, is thought of as civil rights legislation, which of course it is, but also a powerful piece of economic regulation because prior to its enactment, businesses were free to exercise their economic liberty to refuse to do business with or hire minorities in much of the country, and many businesses did just that. Under the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the Department of Justice served as regulator for 48 years, using that law to block the implementation of some roughly 2,400 proposed discriminatory voting changes when the Supreme Court struck down a key component of that law, doing away with much of the relevant federal regulatory framework. Unfortunately, several states then moved fairly quickly to enact their own regulations that have the effect widely of disenfranchising voters of color. Anti-equality voting regulations have been enacted to shorten voter registration, early voting periods, implement photo ID laws, and purge voter rolls of eligible minority voters. I am proud to co-sponsor bipartisan legislation in this Senate, the Voting Rights Advancement Act, which would restore these critical federal regulations in order to protect the rights of minorities to vote. Federal regulation then prevents discrimination in lending, housing, and education against minorities. In each area, regulation has improved the economic opportunities of African Americans and other racial minorities in America, notwithstanding the claims of civil rights opponents who stated they would interfere with economic liberty. In addition to these transformative laws, there's a host of other federal regulatory structures outside the civil rights context that have nevertheless benefited the health, the safety, and the economic opportunities currently available to Americans of color. The Affordable Care Act, for example, has improved access to private health insurance for nearly 8 million African Americans and 4 million Latinos who have gained coverage since passage of the law, decreasing the uninsured rate in the Hispanic community by roughly 27%. Thanks to the ACA, all Americans are today free from discrimination due to pre-existing conditions or lifetime caps and fees associated with routine screenings. These improvements will ensure that the chronic rates of disease in minority communities, diseases like diabetes, heart disease, obesity, will have access to affordable and comprehensive health care coverage to address these challenges. Environmental regulations, which are often held up as prime examples of overregulation of business, protect us all, but are especially crucial to minority communities. Due to the vestiges of housing discrimination and a lack of economic opportunities, many minorities have no choice but to live in areas with very high levels of industrial and atmospheric pollution. In the South Bronx, for example, which is overwhelmingly Hispanic and African American, asthma rates are 4 times the national average due to a heavy concentration of air pollution. A number of studies suggest minorities face 40% more exposure to a variety of toxic air pollution components, sulfates, nickel, silicon, vanadium, which are linked to deaths from cardiovascular and lung disease. They are also exposed to much higher levels of other air toxics like aluminum, which is associated with low birth weight. Instead of asking if environmental regulations go too far, perhaps we should be asking in these circumstances and for these particular communities if they go far enough. The case that regulation harms minorities turns a blind eye to the manifold ways in which regulations have been used to promote equality and justice in healthcare and the environment, as I've already mentioned, but we could also consider workplace safety and payrolls, the ability to fight back as a consumer against unfair trade practices, and indeed in economic terms by producing a level playing field for all businesses. So I look forward to a robust and sustained exchange of views. I join the chairman in welcoming all the witnesses and thanking you for your service to our nation in several cases and for being here today. You have a broad range of relevant experiences, and I look forward to that informing our discussion. If I might, I'd like to briefly offer a special welcome to Mr. Scott on behalf of your representative in Congress and my friend, Congresswoman Terry Sewell, who has also joined us here today. I understand, Mr. Scott, you are a former staffer to Mrs. Sewell and are currently a business leader in the Black Belt region. So I join in stating that we can and must do more together to provide the minority business community with the tools necessary to succeed, and look forward to a vigorous debate as to the role of regulations in doing so. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Coons. Would ask each of the witnesses to please rise. Would you raise your right hand? Do you affirm that the testimony you are about to give before this committee will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? You may be seated. Mr. Barrera, you may begin.
Thank you, Senator. Mr. Chairman and members of the committee and my fellow panelists, my name is Michael Barrera, National Manager of the Economic Prosperity for the Libre Institute, a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization that educates Hispanics on the importance of economic freedom. Thank you for your invitation to testify regarding the impact of federal regulations on the minority community. I will focus my comments on the impact on small businesses and the Hispanic community. Americans are suffering under the crushing burden of overregulation. And I stress overregulation. In 2014, federal regulations cost nearly $2 trillion through higher prices and lost productivity. In a 2008 report, the Small Business Administration found that small businesses, those with fewer than 20 employees, bore the largest burden of complying with federal regulations, facing an annual cost of over $10,000 per employee. This is 36% higher than large firms of more than 500 employees. It should be noted, these were the costs 7 years ago and don't include the cost of compliance with the Affordable Care Act and Dodd-Frank. Federal regulations continue to grow as the number of pages in the Federal Register, as was pointed out, grew from 23,000 in 1960 to over 175,000 today. Additionally, the NFIB reported that for 65 straight months, small business owners cited regulations as a top impediment to conducting business. Also, 21% of small businesses cite regulations as their single most important problem. The U.S. is also losing leadership in business startups, as the growth of regulations contributed to the U.S. falling out of the top 10 worldwide rankings in the ease of starting a business. In fact, the World Bank found it's easier to start a new business in Portugal, Romania, Panama, Hungary, and Belarus than the U.S. One of the most disturbing statistics we found is that business failures now outpace business startups. From 1977 to 2008, the number of new startups outpaced the number of failing businesses by about $100,000 a year. Now startups lag behind closures. These trends concern the Hispanic community and our 4 million businesses, many of which are family-owned. Nationally, family-owned businesses account for 50% of the U.S. GDP, 60% of the country's employment, and 78% of all new jobs. Family business is also important in our community. Mass Mutual reports that 89% of Hispanic entrepreneurs started their business in order to provide financially for their family, and 70% of Hispanic business owners plan to pass that business down to their family members. Additionally, 31% of Hispanic entrepreneurs hire extended family, people like their siblings, their parents, their cousins, their aunts, and their uncles. As such, the impact of federal regulations affect both business and family lives. As federal regulations grow, so does the cost of doing business. This forces entrepreneurs and their families to make difficult choices. Do I spend my time and money complying with federal and local mandates, or do I spend it managing and marketing my business, hiring new employees, or working to increase their wages? This testimony is not a blanket rejection of regulation. It's about overregulation. Elected and non-elected officials must rededicate themselves to weighing the costs and benefits of each proposed rule before proceeding. This is the law. The burden of proof should be on the regulator to prove that a rule is necessary and will benefit our lives and help businesses to prosper, not on small businesses to prove otherwise. Sadly, something is truly amiss when unelected agency officials pass 16 new regulations for every law passed by you, our elected officials. In conclusion, small businesses employ close to 2/3 of American workers and must be more than a convenient talking point when policymakers discuss reviving our economy. Unfortunately, a vast majority of Americans and entrepreneurs, including Hispanics, will tell you government rules and regulations are confusing, complex, time-consuming, and expensive. Moreover, many of our businesses are hesitant to contest, complain, or unable to defend or advocate for themselves due to the expense, time, and in some cases, intimidation borne by federal regulators. It's very important. I heard a great story in North Carolina where a small business talked about, Mr. Burr, I can't reproduce myself. The time I spend complying with federal rules and regulations, I could be spending that personal time, he's a personal trainer, with my customers, researching new ways to help people become healthy, but I spend time with federal regulation. Polls consistently show economy and jobs are a top priority. In other words, how to achieve prosperity. I heard another story in Colorado from a business leader. He talked about government and entrepreneurs' attitude. He said, he summed it up this way. I heard when elected officials talk about laws that they pass, that's all nice and good. But I would rather they talk about the rules and regulations they eliminated to make it easier to do business and to live my life. We believe economic freedom, the rule of law, the free market, and a constitutionally limited government, not excessive regulation or government cronyism, are the pathway to prosper and the best way for each person to achieve their American dream. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Narang.
Thank you. Chairman Cruz, Ranking Member Coons, and members of this subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today. I am Amit Narang, Regulatory Policy Advocate at Public Citizens Congress Watch. Public Citizen is a national public interest organization with more than 400,000 members and supporters. For more than 40 years, we have successfully advocated for stronger health, safety, consumer protection, and other rules, as well as for a robust regulatory system that curtails corporate wrongdoing and advances the public interest. Regulation, which has been adopted to protect the public, has been among the greatest public policy success stories in our country's history. Regulations have made our air far less polluted and our water much cleaner. They've made our food and drugs safer. They've made our workplace less dangerous. They've made our financial system more stable when they have been in place. They have protected consumers from unsafe products and from predatory lending practices, and they've made our cars safer. For minorities in particular, regulations have made our society more equal and fair by outlawing discrimination in many contexts, by giving traditionally disenfranchised minorities the opportunity to vote and participate in our democracy, and by combating policies that expose minority populations to higher rates of pollution and environmental toxins. Indeed, the premise of this hearing has it exactly backwards. Regulations have been crucial in providing basic rights and opportunities to minorities that otherwise would not have existed. The story of regulation should not only be celebrated, but also emulated going forward. And while regulators deserve credit for these successes, the true credit goes to Congress, who passed landmark legislation such as the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the Occupational Safety and Health Act, the Consumer Product Safety Act, the Civil Rights Act, and the Fair Housing Act, laws which gave regulators the authority to protect the public and make our country more equal and fair. On the other hand, when regulatory safeguards have not been in place, regulatory failure has occurred and our country and economy has suffered. Deregulation of the financial industry led to the greatest recession since the Great Depression, costing our country $13 trillion and throwing millions out of work and their homes. A lack of adequate offshore drilling safety measures led to the British petroleum oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico, one of the greatest ecological disasters in our country's history. Tainted food scandals, derailing and exploding oil trains, unsafe children toys leading to injury and recalls, chemical spills in critical waterways, oil and gas pipeline ruptures all share a common theme: under-regulation of dangerous and unfair business practices due to a misplaced faith in industry self-regulation. So while it is true that we have made much progress as a country and that regulation has been critical to that progress, it is also clear that there is much progress to be made. This is why it is so important for Congress to avoid making the problem of under-regulation worse and instead actively engage in efforts to fix what I agree is a broken regulatory system. Our regulatory system is broken in three ways, and the public, including minorities, is paying the price. First, our regulatory process moves far too slow when implementing new laws intended to protect the public. The examples of regulatory delay touch virtually every area of public protection. The new food safety regulations were finalized over 4 years ago, or over 4 years after Congress demanded them. Up to a third of the new Wall Street reforms intended to prevent the next financial crisis still have not been put into place almost 7 years after the financial crash. 5 years after the BP oil spill, and we still don't have safety measures in place to fix one of the primary causes of the oil rig explosion that led to the disaster. These delays are the status quo, not the exception, and are a concern across party lines and ideologies. This summer, the R Street Institute, a libertarian free market-oriented think tank, looked back over the past 20 years to see how often regulators were able to meet deadlines established by Congress. The results were deeply troubling. Regulators missed congressional deadlines a shocking 50% of the time. Regulatory delay is central to the problem of underregulation. Second, our regulatory system does not have the authority and resources to effectively enforce violation of regulations by bad actors, leading to undercriminalization of white-collar crime. The public is deeply dissatisfied, and rightly so, that virtually no individuals or bank executives have been prosecuted in the aftermath of the financial crisis. Similar situation has unfolded in the wake of the General Motors ignition switch scandal. While GM has paid a fine, no individuals were held accountable, and the lead prosecutor even admitted that, quote, there are gaps in the law, end quote, that made it difficult to prosecute individuals. Fines are no more than the cost of doing business will not deter future illegal behavior that costs lives and costs our economy, and they will surely do nothing to change corporate cultures that lead to this wrongdoing. Finally, our regulatory system must adopt approaches to regulating that are precautionary in nature and seek to prevent threats to the public safety or our economy, rather than simply reacting when something goes wrong. Here, Congress has taken promising steps in this direction, although more can be done. For example, the Food Safety Modernization Act shifted our food safety regulatory structure from trying to mitigate tainted food outbreaks, one once they occurred, to actually preventing those tainted food outbreaks in the first place. In some respects, the Wall Street reform law Dodd-Frank adopts the same approach by requiring banks to be better capitalized and preventing them from engaging in risky activity. When passing new laws intended to protect the public, often in response to crises created by underregulation, Congress should be mindful of adopting laws that are designed to prevent crises, not just react to them. Unfortunately, Congress is considering legislation that would make the problems I just outlined worse. So-called regulatory reform legislation, better termed deregulatory reform legislation, would further slow down the rulemaking process by adding numerous redundant and unfunded legal and analytical requirements, likely paralyzing rulemaking as a result. In certain instances, legislation will force the least costly rule to regulated industries, and we saw with the Wall Street crash that the least costly rules to Wall Street were the most costly to the public and small businesses. In terms of enforcement, the imposition of new mens rea and criminal intent standards will make it even harder and surely not easier to prosecute Wall Street and corporate executives for future crimes. Public Citizen stands ready to work with lawmakers across the aisle to make our regulatory system work effectively and efficiently for consumers, minorities, working families, and small businesses. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Sandifer.
Thank you, Senator. I believe economic freedom is the greatest hope for the poor, for immigrants, and for members of minority groups who seek independence and success for themselves and their families. Whenever I think about this subject, I think of the story of Frederick Douglass, who described in his autobiography what it was like to escape from slavery to New Bedford, Massachusetts on the Underground Railroad. He said, quote, "The 5th day after my arrival, I went in search of work. On my way down Union Street, I saw a large pile of coal in front of a house. I went to the kitchen door and asked the privilege of bringing in and putting away this coal. I was not long in accomplishing the job when the dear lady put into my hand 2 silver half-dollars. To understand the emotion which swelled my heart as I clasped this money, realizing that it was mine, that my hands were my own, and could earn more of the precious coin, one must have been in some sense himself a slave. I was not only a free man, but a free working man, and no master stood ready at the end of the week to seize my hard earnings," end quote. Sadly, overregulation at the federal, state, and local levels today deprive many Americans of this fundamental human right to economic liberty. I will give just 2 examples. Occupational licensing laws often force people to satisfy expensive and time-consuming educational requirements before they may pursue their trade. Florida, for example, requires people to have a college degree before they can work as an interior designer. In other words, it is illegal for someone to advise me on what colored drapes to hang in my living room unless that person has spent 2 years in college at the cost of perhaps tens of thousands of dollars. Since Black and Hispanic Floridians are about a third less likely to have a college degree, this restriction makes it much harder for members of these groups to enter this trade. It may not sound like much to you and me to take an exam to get a license, but remember that in addition to the degree requirement, exams are only administered a few times a year, sometimes far away from where people live, so they have to get transportation and a hotel room and pay the licensing fees. All of this helps make entry-level jobs off limits to those who need them most. Minority entrepreneurs are less likely to have a license than their white counterparts, and licensing laws drive them into the underground economy, where they cannot get loans or insurance, are subject to police harassment, cannot advertise openly, and in general are less likely to succeed. Yet licensing laws are on the increase. The White House reported in August in a very thorough and long overdue report that nearly a third of all jobs in America, that is a third of the American dream, is now off limits without some form of government permission. My second example is much worse. A certain kind of licensing law called a Certificate of Public Convenience and Necessity, or competitor's veto law, which has nothing to do with whether a person is qualified or skilled or honest, but simply forbids people from operating a business unless they first get permission from the companies already operating. This sounds absurd, and it is, but it's the law in most states and most major cities. These competitors' veto laws apply to a wide range of businesses, everything from taxicab and limo companies to moving companies, liquor stores, car dealerships, and hospitals. In all these industries, it's illegal to start a new business unless you first get permission from your own competition. Obviously, these laws create a cartel that can be very hard for members of minority groups to break into. Take my client, Maurice Underwood, for example. Maurice lives in Reno, Nevada, where he wants to start a moving company. But Nevada has the most anti-competitive licensing laws in the nation. There, the law says that even if you're fully qualified and have a squeaky clean record, you can't run a moving company unless you first prove that you would not compete against the existing moving companies in the state. To get a license, Maurice would have to provide detailed statements from potential customers, hire a lawyer, attend a hearing before the Nevada Transportation Authority, and prove to state bureaucrats that there's a public need for a new moving company and that a new moving company would, quote, foster sound economic conditions, end quote, whatever that means. Under such vague and anti-competitive restrictions, it's little wonder that people like Maurice find it hard to break into the old boy network. We at Pacific Legal Foundation challenged that law, and that case is still pending in court, but federal courts today typically ignore violations of the right to earn a living. Although Supreme Court Justice William Douglas called it the most precious liberty that man possesses, courts today typically refuse to enforce that right and allow federal, state, and local governments to restrict economic opportunity virtually without limit. This should not be a Republican-Democrat issue. I mentioned Justice Douglas endorsing this right. He was about as liberal as a justice can get. Another liberal Supreme Court justice, John Paul Stevens, warned in the 1980s of the danger of businesses using licensing laws to prevent competition against themselves. Like all restrictions on economic freedom, these laws have a disproportionate impact on members of minority groups because they lack the political influence necessary to get the government to do their will. They turn to courts to protect their rights, and thanks to the theory of judicial restraint, courts typically cover their eyes and ignore these violations. That's what happened in Florida when courts refused to protect the rights of entrepreneurs who wanted to be interior designers and upheld that state's power to impose absurd and unnecessary licensing laws. In my written testimony, I've suggested ways Congress could act today to protect the rights of America's wealth-creating entrepreneurs. Most restrictions on economic liberty are at the state and local levels, and the 14th Amendment gives Congress the power to protect people against state governments violating their rights. Congress should forbid states from imposing unnecessary, burdensome licensing requirements on interior designers, so, for example, and abolish competitors' veto laws across the board. We would never tolerate such laws when it comes to freedom of speech or freedom of religion, and yet we tolerate them when it comes to the right to earn a living without unreasonable government interference, the most precious liberty that man possesses.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Scott.
Good afternoon, Chairman Cruz, Ranking Members Coon, and distinguished members of the Judiciary Subcommittee on Oversight, Agency, Action, Federal Rights, and Federal Courts. I am William Scott, and I serve as the President and CEO of Tri-State Community and Economic Development Business. We provide services to mid-tier and small businesses who provide service solutions to federal, state, and local government, nonprofits, and commercial markets. I thank you on their behalf for giving me the opportunity to speak and to appear before you about the organizations and their opportunities in America. I will be remiss to not acknowledge the Honorable Terry Sewell of the 7th Congressional District of Alabama, who is my Congresswoman. For almost 11 years, I have focused my career on providing economic development and resources to small business. I am the host of the top-rated small business radio show, and my name is The Business Doctor, that reaches over 150,000 people, and the former mayor and council member of the town of Mosses in Lowndes County, Alabama. Over the years, I have worked for the United States Department of Commerce as a partnership specialist and as a Black Belt Outreach Coordinator for the Honorable Congresswoman Terry Sewell of the 7th Congressional District of Alabama. I have completed 12 years of dedicated and decorated service in the United States Army. Helping people and providing quality service is my primary goal in life. My diverse experience allows me to understand issues from multiple perspectives. Though I work with small businesses, economic distressed communities with majority Black population, it is not just these entrepreneurs in Alabama that I represent. According to Fortune, the number of businesses owned by African American women grew 322% since 1997, making Black females the fastest growing group of entrepreneurs in the United States. So while some politicians say that federal regulations are stifling small business growth, the statistics, and I'm here to tell you that that is not the case. A national poll conducted for the American Sustainable Business Council found that lack of demand and not regulation is the biggest problem that small businesses face. Small business owners see regulation as a necessary part of modern economy, 86%, and believe they can live with regulation if they're fair and reasonable, 93%. I understand firsthand the needs of Black entrepreneurs in our community, and I can tell you that regulations play an important role in meeting the needs of our businesses and in protecting our communities. I am also the senior consultant for Emerging Change Makers Network in Alabama. Emerging Change Makers works in the areas of community leadership and social entrepreneur building among historically marginalized communities. We provide professional business consultations to developing and growing small business owners. And to owners, believe that you do not have to choose between growing businesses and social and environmental protection. In fact, our businesses in Alabama understand that we do better because of these protections because they create a level playing field for competition. Much of our work involves accessing capital for our business clients. The success of this effort follows closely their own investment of personal and sweat equity. Therefore, our clients understand that there is a great need for good regulation like Dodd-Frank that protects their investment of hard work and money from risky behavior of the big banks that led to the Great Recession, which devastated small business around the country. Our small business clients also know that the success of their businesses depend on the health of their communities. That is why regulations should protect our communities from chemical and environmental disasters, which disproportionately impact minority communities, is important to us. Environmental Protection Agency regulations aren't stopping Black entrepreneurship. They protect our community so that our businesses can have a future. Regulations are needed to create the conditions under which society as a whole can prosper, so that financial, health, and environmental protection can exist to support the growing economy. That is why I and Emerging Change Makers is a part of the larger efforts of the American Sustainable Business Council and over 250,000 businesses that they represent to advance smart regulation that protects our community and the environment. As we grow, our businesses create good jobs and build a vibrant economy. I am on the ground with Black entrepreneurs and small business owners every day. If you want to really help them, then provide more resources for professional business consultations to minority-owned businesses and provide more resources for compliance assistance and making sure that those small businesses providing services on the federal contracts get paid on time. Efforts to slow down regulation to deregulate are not being a friend to African-American small business. Thank you for the opportunity to be before you.
Thank you, sir. Ms. Loving.
I thank the chairman and this committee for the opportunity to testify today. My name is Sabina Loving. I am the owner and president of Loving Tax Services, an independent tax preparation firm on Chicago's South Side. I am the Loving in the Loving versus IRS lawsuit that successfully challenged an IRS power grab that would have posed national licensing on tax preparers. I'm a small businesswoman trying to stay afloat in the economy while helping people with their tax preparation and building up my community. I should have the right to earn an honest living doing what I love, and so should my employees. Equally important, my customers, not the IRS, should be the ones who decide who prepares their taxes. You almost never hear the IRS or anyone who advocates for tax preparer licensing talking about me or my co-plaintiffs when they talk about the Loving case. It is almost as though they forget that we are real people who are actually being harmed by the anti-competitive IRS licensing scheme. But there are about 300,000 independent tax preparation entrepreneurs like me, many of whom would have been forced to close their businesses. So today, I would like to share my story with you to help you understand how overregulation affects real entrepreneurs like me, why I sued the IRS, and why Congress should not give the IRS new power to license tax preparers. I am a native of Chicago who is blessed to earn a living doing what I love, helping people with their taxes. In 2011, I opened my business, Loving Tax Services, on Chicago's South Side, where there is high unemployment and foreclosure rates. My business was the first to occupy a storefront in at least a dozen years. I've been fortunate enough to employ several people in my community and bring money back into our neighborhood. Ever since I was young, I wanted to be an accountant and work with numbers. I dreamed of one day being able to start my own business. I worked hard to make my dream a reality. I worked full-time as an accountant for major financial firms for nearly a decade. The economic downturn hit my industry so hard, so I decided to take this as an opportunity to realize my American dream. I put myself to work as an independent tax preparer while earning a master's degree. I formed Loving Tax Services in 2010, and I never looked back. Tax preparation is a seasonal industry, and my business model depended on flexibility. Fortunately, I was able to find qualified people who could assist me seasonally. But just as my business was taking off, I learned that the IRS was going to force tax preparers to jump through a bunch of hoops in order to allow them to continue earning a living preparing taxes. For the first time in 100 years, the IRS was imposing a license to prepare tax returns. We would have to pass an IRS-mandated exam, complete continuing education requirements each year. The license would give the IRS great control over tax preparers, making us dependent on the most powerful federal agency for our livelihoods. It also imposed additional costs and burdens on my business, which I would have to pass on to my customers in the form of higher prices. I pride myself in offering lower prices than the major tax firms. I didn't want to raise my prices, but I couldn't afford to make any lower profits. Higher prices meant fewer customers. But if my business shrank, I wouldn't be able to hire people to help me during the tax season. That would put me at a competitive disadvantage to the major tax firms, where we're likely to get my customers, I was going to lose. This licensing requirement didn't apply to everyone. CPAs and attorneys were exempt, even if they had never taken a course in tax law or tax preparation. Even though I had a decade of experience in accounting, I was not a CPA, so I was not exempt. Powerful industry groups lobbied for another exemption. Anyone who was being supervised by an attorney or a CPA could also prepare returns without a license. I wanted the opportunity to hire more employees and supervise them as tax preparers so I could expand my business and serve more of my community. But I didn't write the rules, so I didn't get a special exemption. I knew that this new license would not do anything to protect consumers, that there are already all sorts of laws on the books to do just that. Instead, it protects big tax preparation chains, CPAs, from competition by smaller businesses like mine, many of whom would have been forced to close or shrink their businesses. The end result would be fewer options and higher prices for taxpayers. So that's why I sued the IRS. And I was represented pro bono by the lawyers at the Institute for Justice. Thankfully, we won. But the IRS and big tax preparation chains keep pushing Congress to expand IRS power. After we won the case, several bills were introduced that would authorize tax preparer licensing. Just 2 weeks ago, the Senate Finance Committee announced one proposal. But a national license for taxpayers was a bad policy then, and it's a bad policy now. It is anti-competitive, anti-consumer, and will hurt small businesses like mine. I urge the Senate not to give the IRS any more power and to vote against any bill that would authorize the IRS to license tax preparers. Thank you very much for this opportunity to testify.
Thank you, Ms. Loving, for that powerful testimony. Mr. Mayor.
Chairman Cruz and Ranking Member Coons, thank you for inviting me here today to testify about the importance of environmental protections and public health safeguards in ensuring the safety and well-being of all Americans, especially the communities of color who carry a disproportionate risk of harm caused by pollution. I speak today as the first elected African-American president in the 123-year history of the Sierra Club. The Sierra Club is the nation's largest grassroots environmental organization with 2.4 million members and supporters. In addition to helping people from all backgrounds explore nature, the Sierra Club works to promote clean energy, safeguards health in our community. It protects wildlife and it preserves our remaining wild spaces. In addition, I have been an advocate for clean water, clean air, and environmental justice for over 31 years, including work as a resident in Arbor Hill, Albany, New York, against a waste incinerator that was causing respiratory illness in the community. Also, I'm a father, a husband, a public health analyst for the state of New York. Part of the reason I'm here today is because some of the fossil fuel corporations are spending a lot of money to scare people of color and low-income families into believing that new clean air and clean water safeguards like the Clean Power Plan will hurt them. These corporations and their CEOs are terrified that holding dirty industries accountable would cut into their enormous profits. They want low-income and minority communities to think that these regulations will hurt us, but nothing could be further from the truth. Recently, the National Black Chamber of Commerce, an organization represented here today and heavily funded by the fossil fuel industry, released a bogus report claiming that the Clean Power Plan would hurt African American and Hispanic communities. This is just the latest example of polluters desperately trying to confuse leaders of color and trick them into sabotaging their best interests and the interest of our communities by opposing this essential plan. Unfortunately, these dirty energy companies and those that amplify their information are jeopardizing the health of tens of thousands of kids across the country, and they should be ashamed. Fortunately, most of us aren't buying what these companies are selling. Polls show that African Americans lead the country in support for tackling the climate crisis. A whopping 85% have said they want to see an international climate agreement. Similarly, the polls show that 90% of Latinos want to strengthen the Clean Air and Clean Water Act. 85% want to reduce smog air pollution. It is no surprise that the opponents of the clean air and clean water are fighting against us at every step of the way, just as they have done with virtually every safeguard ever proposed. Acid rain protections, Clean Air Act, we've heard the same talking points from the same industry. They said the sky was falling, but the truth is the air just got cleaner. What is shocking is the big way polluters are using smoke and mirrors to try and confuse communities of color. Big polluters desperately want Black and Hispanic voters to believe that the president's clean air protections will raise their electric bills and cost us jobs, when in reality, the protections will save lives and actually lower these costs. At the same time, all is going on thanks to people in movements like Black Lives Matter and Fight for 15. The call for racial and economic justice is getting louder and stronger. But while we are out on the streets fighting for equality, our kids are being poisoned by the air they breathe. Environmental injustices are taking Black lives. The overwhelming evidence shows that low-income areas and communities of color do not receive equal protection from environmental harm despite suffering the greatest exposure to toxic pollutants. Lacking political power, these communities are frequently chosen as sites for polluting facilities or feel compelled to accept them as a source of jobs despite the health hazards they pose. I know this firsthand by my experience in shutting down the incinerator in Albany. Industry and local government brushed us off for 10 years, but through sheer persistence, we were able to prevail. Because these communities often lack access to adequate health care, community residents face an increased risk of respiratory and cardiovascular illness, cancer, birth defects that can last long after these facilities have ceased to operate. Despite the promise of jobs, such pollution actually causes economic harm, driving down property values and discouraging investment needed to keep communities healthy. Sadly, African Americans are more likely to live near environmental hazards like power plants and be exposed to hazardous air pollution, including higher levels of nitrogen oxide, ozone, particulate matter, and carbon dioxide, while their white counterparts do not. The presence of these pollutants increase rates of asthma, respiratory illness, cardiovascular disease. It puts newborn babies at risk. It causes missed days of work, school. We just can't afford this. African American kids already have the highest rate of asthma in the nation, and our infant mortality rate is nearly double that of the national rate. The conditions in which we are born, grow, work, and live are determined by the difference in our health outcomes, and it is essential to recognize that these circumstances are shaped by the inequalities in the powers and the resources at the local and national and global levels. Helping disadvantaged communities succeed in the forefront of strong and just and clean green economy will benefit them and all Americans. In closing, whether you're talking about new pollution protections against smog, carbon pollution, mercury, or other toxic metals that pollute our air and water, it is important to remember that nearly every major environmental public health safeguard, polluters have predicted dire economic outcomes that never actually will happen. We are living in an alternate universe if we seriously took every instance that they said that these regulations will be the most expensive regulations in history. We got to look at the facts and not look at self-serving polluter propaganda. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Alford.
Good afternoon, Chairman Cruz, Ranking Member Coons, and distinguished members of the subcommittee. My name is Harry C. Alford, and I am the President and CEO of the National Black Chamber of Commerce. The NBCC represents 2.4 million Black-owned businesses within the United States, 140 chapters within the United States, and we have over 80 chapters offshore representing 4 different continents. We are the largest black business organization in the world. I am here to testify about the harmful and adverse effects of overregulation on minorities and their communities. As the hearing title suggests, the continuous stream of unreasonable and overreaching regulations that have come out of the federal government over the last few years has led to the denial of countless opportunities for minorities. Employment opportunities, income opportunities, housing opportunities for minorities, all of these are being compromised by an ever-growing number of federal regulations. At the onset, I think it is important to be clear about something. The National Black Chamber understands and appreciates the importance of regulations within our society. Regulations help keep our workers protected, our water and air cleaner, our food safer, and our consumer products reliable. To name a few, what we do not support are regulations that are based upon erroneous and opaque analysis and process. The rulemaking process and the regulations that come out of it should involve transparency, notice, sound science, quality data, and reliable cost benefits analysis. Without a doubt, there are multiple new regulations that potentially will harm the economic opportunities of minorities, but for today's hearing, I'm going to focus on 2 regulations from the Environmental Protection Agency to illustrate my point. First, there is the EPA's new rule on regulating greenhouse gas emissions from existing power plants, often referred to as the Clean Power Plan. While increased costs often come with increased regulation, the Clean Power Plan in particular seems poised to escalate energy costs for blacks and Hispanics in the United States, including individuals, families, and minority-owned businesses. In light of these concerns, the National Black Chamber of Commerce undertook to examine an effort to examine the potential economic and employment impacts of the EPA carbon regulations, including the Clean Power Plan, on minorities and low-income groups. On June the 11th, 2015, the National Black Chamber of Commerce released a study on the threat of the EPA carbon regulations to low-income groups and minorities. I note that since then, the EPA released the final Clean Power Plan rule, which has difference from the proposal. Nevertheless, we believe that the findings of our study are illustrative of the rule's potential economic impacts. The National Black Chamber of Commerce study found that the proposed Clean Power Plan would impose severe and disproportionate economic burdens on poor families, especially minorities. In particular, the proposed rule would impose the most harm on residents of 7 states with the highest concentration of blacks and Hispanics. These communities also suffer from higher unemployment and poverty rates compared to the rest of the country. Yet the EPA regressive energy tax threatens to push minorities and low-income Americans even further into penalty. Now, we've got statistics which you have written there. I'm not going to go through those now. I want to move on to the National Ozone Air Quality Standard. The second regulation that I want to address today is that ozone proposed rule. Just last week, the EPA finalized a new ozone standard, tightening it up from 75 parts per billion to 70 parts per billion. While the agency adopted the higher end of the range under consideration, a 70 ppb ozone standard still increased the number of areas in the country in non-attainment. This non-attainment classification will severely limit economic and employment opportunities in the affected areas. Unfortunately, this tightened ozone standard likely will hurt not only the nation as a whole, but will disproportionately affect America's urban, low-income, and minority businesses. Now, if a community comes in below 70 parts per billion, it will be deemed entertainment. In the usual amounts of construction, infrastructure projects, development, other elements of a healthy and growing economy can continue. These activities create jobs and generate revenue. On the flip side, the EPA wields a heavy stick for communities that are deemed in non-attainment. It can step in and overrule state decisions to issue permits, stopping development and growth with no consideration of the financial impact or loss of jobs. Air permits, in particular, can be difficult to obtain because companies building or expanding facilities will have to show ozone reductions from other sources. These offsets can be expensive and hard to obtain. For example, in the Houston area, offset prices are $175,000 per ton of nitrogen oxide and $275,000 per ton for volatile organic compounds. In conclusion, The National Black Chamber of Commerce and its members value and support clean air, clean water, and environmental quality, and we recognize the importance of regulations protecting those things. We also value and support economic growth, job creation, and prosperity for our individual members and this country as a whole. These are not mutually exclusive goals, and one does not have to be sacrificed to the other. We appreciate the committee holding this hearing and highlighting these critical issues. Thank you for the opportunity to testify, and I look forward to answering any questions. And the National Black Chamber of Commerce is going to roll on and make this a better and better nation. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Alford. I want to thank each of the witnesses for your very fine testimony. I think this hearing has powerfully illustrated that many of the people paying the biggest price for the economic stagnation we've seen for the last 6.5 years are the most vulnerable among us. That overregulation is stifling opportunity for people who want to achieve the American dream. Indeed, the numbers are sobering. If you compare overall median income in this country in 2009, it was just over $54,000. But in 2013, it had dropped to $51,939. That is a decrease for the average family of $2,120, or 4%. Median income has gone down. I would contrast that to what occurred during the 8 years of Ronald Reagan's administration, when the federal government did not engage in overregulation, and indeed President Reagan pulled back the regulatory burden on small businesses. During those 8 years, median income for the average American family increased $5,555, or 12%. That's a real difference for an average family, whether your income, your household income drops 4% or goes up 12%. But indeed, the contrast is even starker when you look at minority households. Under President Obama, between 2009 and 2013, the median income for African-American households has dropped $789, roughly 2.2%. In contrast, under President Reagan, between 1981 and 1989, the median income for African-American households rose $5,008. That is 18%. It is worth thinking about for everyone here who is concerned about allowing those who are struggling to have an opportunity to achieve the American dream. The market difference for the black families, your median income dropping 2.2% versus rising 18% under Reagan's economic policies. And looking to the Hispanic community, under President Obama, the median income for Hispanic families has dropped between 2009 and 2013, $349, roughly 0.8%. In contrast, under President Reagan, between 1981 and 1989, the median income for Hispanic families rose $2,160, roughly 5.7%. These policies make a real difference in the lives of millions of Americans who are struggling. An extra $5,000 a year for a family that is trying to make ends meet makes an enormous difference. I would note in the Hispanic community, there are roughly 2.3 million Hispanic small business owners. Roughly 1 in 8 Hispanic households is a small business owner. This is something I know personally because my household was one of them. My father, who came as an immigrant from Cuba with nothing, with $100 in his underwear, who couldn't speak English, who washed dishes making 50 cents an hour. He and my mother, when I was a little boy, they started a small business together. The Hispanic community is tremendously entrepreneurial community. And yet these barriers are making it harder and harder for Hispanics and African Americans and anyone who wants a better dream, a better opportunity for their family to start small businesses and to survive. And so, Mr. Barrera, as the former president of the U.S. Hispanic Chamber of Commerce, can you describe some of the challenges that your members faced in dealing with regulations, red tape, and government bureaucracy?
Thank you, Ms. Senator, for the question. I believe a lot of them are facing what we're calling this overregulation. I know I've heard people talk here today about regulation that everybody's against. I don't think that's what we're saying. What we're saying is overregulation is killing initiative. It's killing people to go and achieve much more. What we've seen from a lot of Hispanic community, a lot of them are being forced to open business because they don't have jobs. Many are become part-time workers, and they need to go into business in order to survive. So most of them most people, they want to comply with the rules and regulations. They don't want to cheat. They want to do the right thing. But it's becoming so confusing nowadays that they don't know which way to turn. They want to, I said, they want to be able to provide for the families and be a great business and be a great partner with their customers. They spend so much time, as with some of the examples we heard today, of trying to comply and not make any mistakes. They don't know which way to turn. One of the best examples I can say that they have problems with: do I need to get a lawyer? Do I need to get an accountant? Do I need to go to Washington, D.C.? I don't have money for any of that. I need to be able to do business. That's probably the best way to respond to your question at this point.
You know, one of the things I've tried to do in my time in the Senate is host small business roundtables across the state of Texas, bring small business owners and listen to their concerns. And every one of these roundtables, I just open it up and say, share the biggest issues that are weighing on your heart, the biggest challenges you're facing. I've never held a small business roundtable in the state of Texas where at least half of the small business owners didn't list Obamacare as the single biggest impediment to their small business surviving and creating jobs. The consistency with which small business owners say that over and over again. And of course, small businesses produce 2/3 of all new jobs. So if small businesses are being hammered, that in turn has a direct result on the jobs that are available to people. One study by the American Action Forum finds that Obamacare is reducing small businesses between 20 and 99 employees pay, the salary you're taking home, by at least $22.6 billion annually, and that the laws, regulations, and increasing premiums have reduced employment by more than 350,000 jobs nationwide. In Texas, for example, the study finds that workers and businesses with 50 to 99 workers are seeing upwards of $1,000 less in take-home pay and a nearly 20% increase in premiums because of Obamacare. And Texas small businesses with 20 to 49 employees have shed nearly 30,000 jobs since Obamacare came into effect. Mr. Pereira, can you talk about the impact of Obamacare on small businesses?
We've seen the same thing. In fact, there was a business in Texas, a restaurant owner, he actually forego opening a second restaurant because of the expenses of Obamacare. And it's not because they don't want the people insured, but the way it was written, what's so confusing for people, and nobody's been able to find this answer, why did we drop the work week from 40 hours to 30 hours? And small businesses aren't dumb. They're there to make a profit. And so when you start raising the cost of hiring people and imposing more costs like Obamacare on them, they're going to find another way to cut costs. And as we all know, businesses, when they want to cut costs, they cut employees. Well, like it or not, that's what the first expense are going to do. So I would like to know, I think a lot of businesses I talk to, they would like to know, why did we drop the hours from the 40-hour work week to the 30-hour work week? Because that's all it's done is hurt more people and cause more part-time jobs. And the scariest thing are the children. Yep. And the teenagers, because we've got a lot of retirees and people who used to work full-time, they're now part-time, which has pushed out the youth. So that's hurt a lot of people.
Ms. Loving, I want to thank you for your particularly powerful testimony. That is testimony I think every American should watch. And the nightly news should put your testimony on television, because it tells a uniquely American story of struggling to create a business and facing powerful interests coming against you. I want to ask you, Ms. Loving, who gets hurt by overregulation and by occupational licensing laws putting barriers to forming a small business?
Thank you, Senator Cruz. The consumers get hurt because it creates barrier to entry for small businesses. So bigger firms can absorb costs, where an extra $1,000 to my bottom line is significant, because I'm dealing with a limited number of resources. And if there's not enough competition, then consumers are stuck with the big firms. They have fewer choices. There's fewer options, and it becomes a monopoly of sorts. So they have no other options but to pay exorbitant fees for tax prep fees that really don't do anything special for them at all.
And you mentioned also that these regulations benefited the rich and powerful, those with lobbying influence in Washington, those who had law degrees or accounting degrees. But for someone that wanted to start a small business in the south side of Chicago, you didn't have the same lobbyist working on your behalf.
I don't have the same resources. So therefore, I don't have people coming to Congress and talking to the elected officials on my behalf. And it's just me, and there's 300,000 other people just like me.
Well, thank you for telling your story, and thank you for your standing up to the power of government and to the power of big money and lobbying, trying to put barriers in the way to your starting your business, you're creating jobs, and you're helping your community.
I appreciate being invited.
Mr. Alford, I want to ask a final question.
Yes, sir.
The National Black Chamber of Commerce, you described a study that you recently did on the EPA's climate change regulations. And in particular, one result of that study caught my attention, which is that the National Black Chamber of Commerce concluded that the EPA's new rules could cost as many as 125,000 African Americans in Texas their jobs, and an even more astounding 325,000 Hispanics in Texas their jobs. Those are staggering numbers, and those are numbers in the minority community.
Yes, sir.
People that want to have a fair chance to achieve the American dream. But Mr. Alford, what would you suggest that a politician who supports these rules say to the 125,000 African Americans in Texas who will lose their jobs under them, to the 325,000 Hispanics who will lose their jobs? How should a politician justify his or her support for rules costing them their livelihood?
I don't see how one can be honest and looking at it as it is for what it is and smile or try to justify it. There's 10 million nationally, 10 million jobs nationally, and we haven't rebounded from 2008. And people who get billions of dollars from environmental organizations, and we have to scrub along and, make 20,000 here, 20,000 there, but we carry the weight. But one of the strangest things that happened, sir, last week I was in Paris, working on a plan with our Paris chapter to where we've got an $80 billion commitment from some philanthropists in France that are going to fund electrical projects in Africa. And we're going to do this with the African-American contractors, engineers, infrastructure, and take it over to Africa and start lighting up the villages and such. The interesting thing is, though, the French are very strong on the Kyoto Treaty, very strong on environmentalism, but their approach is, if it can't be done, it can't be done. We have to wait till technology catches up. They don't put a gun to your head and say, you got to do this or go out of business. And that's what I thought was very interesting, that they have a common sense approach to it. We're going to put in a clean Africa electrical grid, and we're going to be friendly to the earth. But if we try to do that here in this country under our rules, this stop us dead in the tracks.
Thank you, sir. Senator Coons.
Thank you, Chairman Cruz. I'm going to defer my questioning to Senator Klobuchar, given the press of her time and schedule, if I might.
Thank you very much, Senator Coons, and thank you, Chairman Cruz, and thank you, Senator Hatch. As I look at Senator Coons and Senator Hatch, I think about the regulatory work we've done together since I've gotten here. I represented businesses for years in the private sector on regulatory issues, so I understand some of the issues you're talking about, Mr. Alford, and that's why Senator Coons and I teamed up on doing something on the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act on immigration, and Senator Hatch and I have done a lot of work with medical device and trying to not only on the tax side, but also the regulatory side to make it easier for our businesses. At the same time, as a prosecutor and then as a mom, I've seen how you need some regulations in place to protect the safety and health of our citizens, to protect our clean air and water. whether it's working on lead in children's toys, which I know you're aware of, Mr. Mayor, a bipartisan bill that we passed, the formaldehyde work I did with Senator Crapo, that there are times when you need regulations in place to protect the people that we're supposed to be representing. So, Mr. Naring, I think I'd start with you in terms of if you want to talk just very briefly about an example of regulations that you think have helped people, that you think is important for the minority communities.
Sure. Thank you, Senator. So I want to refer to a current topic and a current issue of concern for minority communities, and that is predatory lending. We are seeing higher rates of predatory lending abuse of minorities than the general public. And that should be a concern. I know it is a concern for the minority community. And so I am glad, and Public Citizen supports strong measures from the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau that will address predatory lending schemes that are costing minorities sometimes their livelihoods. They are definitely resulting in significant costs to our economy.
And I guess that's a good segue to Mr. Scott, because as I was hearing Senator Cruz talk about some of those economic numbers, I think we know that part of the difficulty was during the recession, the minorities were inordinately hit with foreclosures and other things because of what was going on in the financial industry. Do you want to comment on either on that or what you see as some rules that would be helpful to the minority community in terms of business as an entrepreneur yourself? I really want to ask what it was like working for Congresswoman Sewell, but I'll leave that for later. So go ahead.
Sure. I think that there are regulations that help us, that work along with business owners, that are not stifling or that are holding businesses back in any kind of way, but that help maybe with clean food. Since I hear a lot of times deal with farmers, and a lot of times we deal with putting seeds in the ground that has nourishment towards coming into our bodies, and having regulations in place that require and having those nutrients in place, they help with our life as a whole. Because if we don't have things in place, we won't actually be here today. And I look at, too, within looking in this room, we have wood that's in here, that this building, this table, and everything's made out of wood. And without regulation, would we have clean wood in here, or would it be contaminated? Would the carpet that we walk on, would the carpet be the quality that it is, or would it just tear up as soon as it's put down? So I think that those regulations, when working along with business owners, can be something that's beneficial to everybody.
Thank you. Mr. Mayor, I think we've seen the studies and the numbers, and you brought them up about how minorities are inordinately hurt by environmental problems or toxic waste sites and things like that. Do you want to elaborate on that?
Yes. Again, the question was who gets hurt. And who gets hurt happens to be the very communities that folks are here claiming that this so-called policy or proposal would benefit. It is a cruel irony. But, 7 out of 10 African Americans live in areas where there's unsafe air, and we're 3 times more likely to be admitted to hospitals for asthma. And more importantly, when we talk about what are the benefits of the Clean Power Plan, we're talking about a $54 billion estimated worth in public health benefits and climate benefits. We're talking about 3,600 fewer premature deaths. We're talking about 90,000 fewer asthma attacks in children, 1,700 heart attacks, 1,700 fewer hospital admissions. So when we're talking about benefits, the benefits are real and tangible. And the data, again, support this.
Thank you so much. Just 2 last things I wanted to mention. One, I won't go into it. Maybe I'll ask you about it later in writing. But Senator Collins and I last year introduced something called the SCORE Act. She's a Republican senator from Maine, to look back 5 years later at some of these rules and regulations to see how they've affected the economy, and ways to look and see if we need to make changes to look at things in a measured way. So I'd ask you to look at that. But I guess I just wanted to end with one set of rules that I think cries out for change, and that is immigration reform. And I know that the Hispanic Chamber, which you're involved, has been a supporter, as well as the Chamber of Commerce in general. And we worked really hard on the Senate bill, and particularly Senator Hatch and I worked on this issue of entrepreneurs. And and bringing in entrepreneurs. The fact that 90 of our Fortune 500 companies were formed by immigrants, 200 of them were formed by immigrants and kids of immigrants. 30% of our U.S. Nobel laureates were born in other countries. Yet we literally allow for unlimited visas for wild hockey players. You may not cover our team, Mr. Barrera, or be a fan, but that is our professional hockey team. So all the hockey players can come in from Canada, but the Mayo Clinic can't bring in a doctor because their spouse can't work for 7 years, or 3M can't bring in an engineer. And I just wondered if quickly you two on either end here could just comment on your views on getting immigration reform done from that entrepreneurial standpoint.
Well, I think when it comes to workers, I mean, we have to improve our legal immigration system, and we need reform. I don't think anybody here would deny that. So we need to work on legal immigration so we get the best workers. This is a country of immigrants, so we agree that we have to have some kind of immigration reform that takes into account to get the workers that the businesses need. Whether they be hockey players or people in agriculture, we need to have an immigration reform, and Libre Institute stands ready to assist in any type of reform.
Mr. Alford.
America isn't half full, and what we need is a program that is logical and people can follow and have some integrity about it. But 80% of the black retail businesses in New York City are owned and operated by the Africans or Caribbeans. They come to work, they come with their skills, and we should welcome them with open arms.
Thank you very much. I also would note it's one of Grover Norquist's top priorities because it brings the debt down so significantly if we passed comprehensive immigration reform. So I will leave you with that note. Thank you for being here.
Thank you very much. Senator.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Barrera, I'll direct this question at you, but I want to make a few comments before I actually form the question. Federal regulations today impose, by some estimates, a burden of about $1.88 trillion on the economy. That's roughly $15,000 for every single household in this country. That's more than corporate and individual income taxes combined. Too much regulation, especially too much outdated regulation, means higher prices, smaller paychecks, and fewer jobs for hardworking Americans. And we know that the communities that are struggling the most with the costly rules that I think this administration and Washington bureaucrats keep piling up are the ones that can least afford to do so. Now, every president since Jimmy Carter has agreed on the need to review our regulatory burden, make sure that it is no more intrusive and burdensome. That is absolutely necessary. Nevertheless, regulations keep accumulating year after year. The Code of Federal Regulations is now more than 175,000 pages and contains more than 200 volumes. And according to a study by the American Action Forum, the Obama administration's efforts to review old rules actually added more than $23 billion in cost to the economy and nearly 9 million hours of paperwork. Now, to turn this longstanding bipartisan commitment to streamline our regulatory burden into a reality, we need to take the responsibility of clearing out old regulations away from the bureaucrats who keep failing at the job. And that's why I've introduced the Scrub Act, which uses the successful model of the independent BRAC Commission and applies it to get rid of a big chunk of regulatory overreach and burden. Now, I just wonder if you agree with me that far from providing small businesses with relief from our crushing regulatory burden, the Obama administration's regulations have made the business environment much more challenging, especially for minority-owned businesses. And do you agree with me that simply relying on Washington bureaucrats to get rid of their own bad regulations is like asking the proverbial bunch of foxes to guard the chicken coop?
Thank you for your question, sir. I think what most minority business and business in general, we used to talk about, my dad used to like to talk about this. He goes, when you work with government, I don't want your hand out. I'm not even concerned about your hand up. I don't even want your hand shake when it comes to regulators, because really once you get out of my way, because I want to have the freedom to do business in the best way that I can. And regulators, like we talked about, For every law passed, they passed 16 new regulations for every law passed. Right. How can people do that? And they keep piling on one and the other. And I can almost guarantee you that any law that we have now, it's already there. We don't need to go do more and don't need any more new regulations because I can guarantee you it's already there. But if they, I do agree that we need to go in and see what we have so we know what we got to get rid of. And I think one of the best thing quotes I've ever heard is from Colorado. You know, it's all fine and great when we pass new laws, but come and tell me what you got rid of. Because the more you get rid of them, that makes it gives me more freedom to do business. And I think everybody on this panel would agree. We're not against regulation. We want clean air. We want safe food. Nobody's against that. But it's the overregulation that's really depressing the freedom and spirit and ingenuity and hard work attitudes of true Americans to prosper. We've talked about some of the other things going on here. A lot of the problems that we have here are due to poverty. And poverty occurs because there's no economic ability to get out of poverty. So if you keep depressing business, particularly small business, to prosper, you're only going to hurt poverty, and we need to work on that.
Well, thank you, Mr. Senator. We've heard extensive testimony about the explosive growth of federal regulations and their troubling effect on economic opportunity, especially in minority communities. Now, despite these harmful effects, regulations keep piling up, as both Mr. Barrera and I have been saying, making the situation worse and worse with each passing year. Now, this massive accumulation of regulations is due in large part to the fact that the current process by which agencies make regulations is utterly broken. From curtailing the opportunity for meaningful input by the public to flouting the legal requirements for transparency and accountability. Now, given this mess, the courts are often the only practical means of holding this out-of-control bureaucracy accountable. But doesn't excessive deference by courts to agencies critically limit that opportunity to hold the agencies accountable? Instead, hasn't this deference allowed the agencies to expand the scope of their power dramatically, allowing them to pile up more and more damaging regulations?
Oh, yes, Senator, absolutely. The problem is that courts defer so excessively to the administrative agencies that agencies have become basically a fourth branch of government, unelected, hired. Many of these administrative agencies are staffed by members of government unions, so you can't even fire them if you have to, who write regulations, investigate potential violations of those regulations, and then punish people for violating those regulations in violation of the constitutional principle of separation of powers. And courts not only defer to their decision-making in general, but they defer to their findings in ways that violate basic rules of due process. So, for example, a lot of the time, administrative agencies will hold informal hearings, and the evidence that they're allowed to receive, they're not bound by the federal rules of evidence, and so they can receive evidence like hearsay, for instance, which would be barred from a courtroom. Then when you appeal from the administrative agency, and you're always going to lose in front of the administrative agency because the prosecutor's paying the judge, right? So when you appeal to the court, a lot of the time, this is especially true of state courts, the courts are locked. They're not allowed to receive any more evidence than what the administrative agency already received. So evidence that would never have been admitted in a courtroom, like hearsay evidence, becomes the only evidence that the judge is later able to consider when he considers the appeal. That's in violation of basic principles of due process. So we need a judiciary that is more skeptical toward administrative agencies, that are unelected agencies, that enjoy often extremely broad power to regulate in whatever they think is the public interest without any checks and balances. That's what the courts are supposed to provide, and unfortunately they've fallen short many times.
I've gone over my time, but let me just make one comment. It's said by many people that the D.C. Federal District Court and the Circuit Court of Appeals are so pro-regulation. And they're the courts that hear these matters more than almost any other.
Right.
And frankly, almost always find on the side of the regulatory bodies. I think they got to wake up and start realizing that they're part of the problem as well. And I'm very concerned about it because, we see minorities, not just minorities, but minorities in particular, who are just getting killed by this over-regulatory nature of our society. I'm hoping we can get that scrub back through. That would start to peel through all these over-regulatory approaches and allow the good regulations to stay.
If I may agree with that, one of the big problems is that we don't know the costs of regulation, and we can't assess those costs because the costs of regulation typically take the form of the businesses that are never started, the projects that are never begun, the people who look at how difficult it is and say, well, why should I even bother? So when we hear statistics that say, well, existing businesses are fine with the regulatory burden, of course they are. They're already in business. They can afford to absorb those costs, but entrepreneurs, they can't, and very often they give up, and then we never see the wealth that they could have created, but which was stifled by the regulatory burdens.
Well, sometimes we justify this over-regulatory approach because of the ills of our society, but we've got to have the guts to get involved and look at the stuff that we don't need and get rid of it and save the trillions of dollars that we're losing right now because of this over-regulatory nature of our society. And I think it's very important for the minority community to, throughout the country, to take this on and start realizing that, the federal government is not the last answer to everything. And frankly, in many ways, it's the impediment in our society because we don't get rid of the bad stuff. And yet you're still having to comply with a lot of bad things that really tear up, especially minority businesses. So I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman, and also the distinguished senator from Delaware for allowing me to go over a little bit. Thank you. And I want to thank all of you for being here today. It's been very helpful.
Thank you, Senator Hatch. Senator Coons.
Thank you, Chairman Cruz. Mr. Narang, given what your research, as well as the research by OMB and other independent organizations, has found about some of the positive effects of regulation on our economy, and in particular, protection, promotion of health and other concerns of the minority community, how do you explain or respond to testimony we've heard today from a number of witnesses that regulations are principally responsible for killing jobs?
Thank you, Senator. So I do want to make clear, and I know my testimony makes clear, that regulation obviously does provide benefits. I know a lot of the discussion so far has not centered on that. It's very true that there are opportunity costs, if you will, of not regulating. I think we saw that very clearly in the Wall Street crash. Deregulation led to many of the economic woes that we are currently experiencing now, and it's clear that numbers dating back from 2010 do track the severe damage that was caused to our economy. Let me also just back up and say, in terms of setting policy priorities, in terms of determining what are good regulations that are worthwhile, it's very important to keep regulatory benefits in mind and to make decisions based on regulatory benefits as well as costs. I think a simple analogy probably shows how intuitive this is. I mean, when you go to a grocery store, you're not just looking at the cost of the food as the only determining factor as to whether you would buy food. Of course, in that instance, you wouldn't buy any food. Now, it's a little bit difficult to determine sometimes, just as is with the regulatory state, what the benefit of that food is, but clearly it's a critical benefit with respect to livelihood. If you look at the macro level, same thing applies when making policy decisions on regulatory policy. The benefits have to be taken into consideration.
Thank you, Mr. Narang. Mr. Mayor, can you just elaborate on that point with respect to environmental regulations and how they affect minority communities and how we should do the cost-benefit analysis?
Yes, Senator Coons. In our 40-year history of the Clean Air Act, public health safeguards in the economy have actually prospered with regards to cleaning up air and water. In fact, under the Clean Air, we've actually seen these safeguards improve and actually grow new businesses. In fact, under the President's Clean Power Plan, it's projected that by 2020, under these low standards, modest standards, over 360,000 jobs will be created. The real issue, I think, has been pointed out on one level, because there's a little bit of a bait and switch here, is that while they're saying it's collapsing industry, and as my colleague to my left has mentioned that his business has to go to Africa to implement a clean power standard, the fact of the matter is that big coal and big carbon, big our industry is absolutely stifling that opportunity. We can actually have that job creation here in the United States right now. It was the United States where we talk about the solar and wind industry was born, but yet through the big cartels, those opportunities have been pushed off. So we talk about real jobs lost and really repowering and retooling America and getting America back on a green, clean clean footing, while at the same time reducing ozone and greenhouse gases and, as I say, improving our climate. Again, these are things that are under the control right now, or heavily influenced of the big carbon and big oil industry. So blocking the president's efforts on the Clean Power Plan, I think, actually really is the real test of, as I say, doing real economic harm to the average American community.
Thank you, Mr. Narang. Do you agree with the claims that were just being debated there? Mr. Alford earlier made claims that the Clean Power Plan will result in job loss and increased energy costs and rising poverty among Hispanic and African American communities.
So Public Citizen strongly supports the Clean Power Plan, and it's not just because it's a win for the environment, it's also a win for consumers. We're doing groundbreaking research right now, looking state by state at the actual benefits to consumers in terms of lower electricity prices, partially including the energy efficiency measures in the Clean Power Plan, not just the carbon regulation measures. And what you're seeing is that across the board, consumers would see lower electricity prices, and they would see higher electricity prices, of course, in the absence of the Clean Power Plan.
Well, thank you. Well, my time's expired. I'll let you do another round if you want. We're going to do a second round.
Thank you, Senator Coons. It's rather striking. This is a hearing on overregulation. And yet, as I review both the written testimony and the oral testimony of the three witnesses invited by the Democrats, Mr. Narang, Mr. Scott, Mr. Mayer, that none of the three of you have identified even a single example of overregulation. And I'm curious if it's your collective view that every regulation is a good thing, that it never goes too far, that more and more government power over our lives is always good. Is there not really one example of overregulation that any of the Democratic witnesses here can point to?
Senator, I'm sure there is. I would say that those who are pushing for less regulation, it is incumbent upon them to demonstrate those examples of overregulation. And I will say that I've been quite surprised that we hear in the abstract instances of massive amounts of overregulation, but there are very few examples that are offered, very few detailed technical regulations that folks are saying, justify massive reforms to the regulatory process that would stop regulation.
So I take it that answer is a no, then, that you can't identify a single example of overregulation.
Well, I believe I can. I would have to get back to you on that.
But as you sit here today, you can't. And in preparing your testimony, you did not. Is that correct?
Again, I think it's incumbent on those who believe that overregulation is the current most pressing problem in our regulatory system to demonstrate those examples.
Right. Thank you. That is a no. Mr. Mayor, I found it very interesting when you took over at Sierra Club. You were quoted in a High Country News interview as saying that it was your goal to change things and to be a change agent, to make sure that, quote, when laws and regulations are fashioned, they're not advantaging one group over another, which was a very interesting statement. And I'm curious which regulations in particular you were referring to that were benefiting one group over another.
Well, right now, the most pressing regulations benefiting one group over another is the insistence by the carbon industry to maintain the status quo at the expense of, say, opportunities with regards to development and advancement of clean power. And so I think that, we have a huge opportunity here when we talk about regulation and our transition from dirty power to clean power to advance new alternatives. We should not have to have African Americans going to Africa to green and put in a smart grid and green grid in Africa. We should be financing those incentives here in, say, Detroit or here in New York. So the opportunity of where and how regulations are employed, are very, very critical and clear. And from the point of justice, when we talk about justice, in other words, regulations or what we call safeguards, it's about the equal protection and enforcement under the law. So the question is, so when we talk about regulations and regulatory reform, in this case, safeguards that are protective of human health, we need to look at some of the communities that are being burned.
Mr. Mayor, I want to keep the focus of the hearing on the topic of the hearing, which is in particular the burdens on the minority community of overregulation. Now, you mentioned that your organization disagrees with the Black National Chamber of Commerce's conclusion about the impact of the Obama administration's climate change rules on jobs. In your view,
No, I did not say that, sir.
You don't disagree with his study?
I disagree with his study.
Right. No, that's what I just said.
Yes, okay.
You mentioned you disagree with that study.
Yes, sir.
In your judgment, how many jobs will those new regulations cost?
Well, the answer is that it won't cost. It will create jobs. And I think that one of the things that we need to look at is the data that are supplied by an independent study that was done by the EPA using Department of Labor data. And in fact, what it showed that by 2020, we'll actually have a net increase of 360,000 jobs.
And how much will it drive up the electricity bill of the average consumer to put these massive new regulations on the generation of electric power?
Actually, sir, it will not drive up the cost of the average consumer. In fact, the Clean Power Plan would reduce cost.
Yeah, I'm curious. Is it your position that over the last 6.5 years, the average consumer's electric bill has gone up or down?
Sir, the Clean Power Plan and the proposals and safeguards under it have just been promulgated.
But you said a minute ago, when I asked, is there any regulation that's bad, you could not point to a single regulation in 175,000 pages. My question is, we've had 6.5 years of this administration putting oppressive environmental regulations in place, and you said, well, this new wave of regulations, it's not going to impact any jobs, it's not going to impact electricity bills. My question is simple. Have consumers' electric bills gone up or gone down in the last 6.5 years?
Sir, the test is in the pudding when we see the Clean Power Plan fully implemented.
I'm asking about the pudding today, though, not the future pudding, because I'm willing to bet 6.5 years ago you made the same predictions that the onerous regulations being put in place then weren't going to cost any jobs, weren't going to raise electric bills. So were you right?
Senator, when we talk about existing status quo right now, doing nothing is costing jobs. Doing nothing is poisoning our economy. Doing nothing is taking human health. When we talk about the Clean Power Plan and, as I say, the new policies that are moving forward, shifting to this new clean, green economy will actually create jobs, not reduce them, sir.
I think the record will reflect and the facts will reflect that the average consumer's electric bills have gone up dramatically, despite promises that would not happen.
Under the existing old regime, sir.
You're right. Under the existing Obama
no, not this, sir. Under the existing carbon regime, sir.
The existing Obama EPA has driven up electric bills dramatically and has cost already vast numbers of jobs. A final question. Mr. Sandifer. You talked quite powerfully about occupational licensing in a host of areas. I want to ask you the same question I asked Ms. Loving. Who gets hurt by these laws, and who do they benefit? Why are they put in place?
Well, laws like these typically go in place because entrenched industry, which has influence with the regulatory agencies, is able to flex its muscle and excuse what it's doing as, oh, well, we're protecting the public. Force an interior decorator to get a 2-year college degree before they're allowed to decorate houses, and that's good for the public. Well, I guess it would be a better thing if interior decorators had a college degree than if they didn't. And those interior decorators who do have a college degree, and so they get licenses, they will report, oh, we're perfectly fine with the regulations. We have no problem with the regulations. And then you'll have witnesses up here saying existing businesses have no problem with the regulations, right? It's the entrepreneurs who wanted to get jobs in that industry, who are blocked from doing so, who have to go get a job somewhere else or get no job at all. Those are the unseen costs of the regulation, and that factors into the increased cost to the consumer, which raises prices, as you mentioned. And of course, therefore, that's what Ms. Loving said, that it harms consumers because they have less choice and they pay more. But I'm much more focused on the rights of entrepreneurs, the people who create the wealth that you people all redistribute. They're the people whose rights I'm concerned with, and they're very often blocked from the opportunity that this country is supposed to promise by laws that require a third of them to get government permission before they can do their job for things as simple as floristry. Louisiana has a law that says you have to have a license to be a florist. That's obviously absurd. It's so absurd, no other state has a law like that. It doesn't protect the consumer. It protects entrenched industries against legitimate competition from entrepreneurs.
And Mr. Sandifer, are there successful American businesses that began with humble beginnings long ago that would be illegal today or impossible based on this current wall of regulations?
Oh, of course. 100 years ago, an immigrant or a black entrepreneur could paint the word taxi on the side of his car. And there you go, right? And as long as he's insured, as long as he doesn't run somebody over, and if he does, he's going to get punished for that by the existing regulations, and those are safety regulations everybody at this panel would agree with. But under today's laws in most states and metropolitan areas, they have to get permission from their own competition before they can start up a taxi business. We've all read the headlines about Uber, but it's not just Uber that's an example of this. My client, Maurice Underwood, wants to start a moving business. How harmless can you get a moving business? He should be allowed to paint the word mover on the side of his truck and go into business. Instead, he has to hire a lawyer, go to a hearing, and prove to government bureaucrats that his business would foster sound economic conditions, which nobody knows what that means. So these businesses stifle entrepreneurship. And to hear these witnesses say, oh, well, everything's fine, the industry's fine, we don't see any job loss, it reminds me of the story of the man who jumped off the 100-story building and as he passes the 50th floor says, well, so far so good. Right? That's the problem that we've got when it comes to the economy in this country. We have a healthy economy that could recover if we would let it, and too many rules mean that we can't let it. I could spend the entire day listing the bad regulations that these other witnesses have somehow been unable to identify, but we all have time to worry about. So,
Thank you very much, Mr. Sandifer. Senator Coons.
Thank you, Chairman Cruz. If I might, Mr. Mayor, Mr. Alford testified earlier that the new EPA ozone regulations will harm minority communities and that the Clean Power Plan will harm minority communities. Do you agree with that? And what evidence do you point to? And frankly, Mr. Alford cited a study by the Black Chamber of Commerce, and I'm wondering if the Sierra Club has any competing sources of information that they would like to point to.
Yes. One of the things that we definitely rely upon is the EPA data, and according to our studies, is that actually, the ozone studies are one of the critical pieces whereby, our human health would be greatly impacted and affected, sir. And specifically,
Mr. Mayor, if I might give you a minute to sort of work through any answer to that, I'm going to move on to other witnesses if I might. Mr. Scott, Mr. Alford, you've said that on behalf of 2 million African-American owned businesses, you oppose environmental regulations, the ACA, Dodd-Frank, a range of things, and I may be mischaracterizing your testimony, so feel free to correct me, because they've largely caused job loss at minority-owned businesses rather than creating opportunities. Is that correct?
I didn't mention Dodd-Frank, but it certainly is an example. It dried up money on the street. The SBA won't even print their numbers of 7(a) loans to black businesses because they're so ashamed. They've locked it up. The XM Import Bank wanted our help because they were being deauthorized. I asked them to give me one loan they have made to a black business anywhere in this world. I've been waiting 6 months for that answer. They don't do it. We are on our own. We have no small business government, and we're finding other ways. The San Francisco chapter is putting a $200 million development with Shanghai money through EB-5 visas. We have to get creative. Our own banks are going to do it, so we'll find a way. And in terms of asthma, there is no source to say how asthma is formed. There is no cure for asthma. Asthma has increased as the ozone has gone down. I grew up in Los Angeles. Let me tell you, we've improved the air a whole lot. When you're playing football on Saturday afternoon in LA in 90-degree weather, we have improved a whole lot. Asthma has gotten worse. There is no correlation between ozone and asthma.
Well, thank you, Mr. Alford. Mr. Scott, as a minority business owner yourself and someone who works regularly with minority business entrepreneurs, do the positions Mr. Alford's taking, his characterization of the impact on regulation, represent you fairly as a minority business owner?
I would say that it does not. And the reason I say that is that I think that one thing that we've been able to do through businesses that I've worked along with, and also with small business development centers that are across this nation that are available, is to use more of a cooperative approach of businesses working together to find people maybe who've actually went through the system and maybe followed regulations, became qualified, and bringing them in as an expert, and then sharing that knowledge to work as a team to make sure that we can help businesses that want to get certified or go through regulations of that nature. And that was a way that I think that we was able to avoid some things maybe other people have worked through, because we try to communicate and work together. And I think that when businesses work together as a team, just like the same rules of playing sports, when you work together as a team and we all have rules, you use those rules to your advantage towards making things work instead of fighting against the rules that are in place. And rules are not bad.
Sir, may I?
Thank you, Mr. Scott. If I might, Mr. Chairman, noting the passage of time, I'd just like to put into the record a letter from the U.S. Black Chambers, a African-American-led business organization with over 100 self-sustaining Black Chamber members around the country.
That's not true. That's been proven in a court of law. That's not true.
Mr. Alford?
Yes, sir.
I'm speaking. Thank you very much, sir. Forgive me. But the letter that I'm going to enter into the record from the president, Mr. Busby, says, among other things, that studies have shown African Americans are suffering an increase in asthma and respiratory issues. In no small part because many Black families live near power plants in areas with unhealthy ozone levels. And it goes on to support the Clean Power Plan as the solution that will reduce health-related respiratory risks. And that strikes me as just a point in counterpoint that is worth raising. And if I might, Mr. Mayor, did you want to make a closing point before I run out of time?
Well, yes, I think that the blanket statement that there is no real correlation between ozone and asthma, it just flies in the face of these studies by the American Lung Association as well as our research, CDC. These are some of the biggest triggers with regards to asthma, with regards to air quality. So I think that one of the big, as they say, big dirty dozen, it's not only is it a greenhouse gas, but also by the same token, it is one of those areas which, where if you look at the studies in the areas where populations have high asthma risk and ozone levels, the studies are there to support that.
And if I might, in closing, the Union of Concerned Scientists, which was not represented here today, but has also raised some questions and concerns. Mr. Chairman, if I might enter into the record a post from the Union of Concerned Scientists that raises issues based on the EPA's own cost-benefit analysis, studies from the NAACP about the racially disparate impact of pollution on minorities, cites a recent study by the University of Maryland, that all conclude that the Clean Power Plan may in fact have a net positive impact on minority communities, and raises some serious questions about the Black Chamber of Commerce study that was relied upon by Mr. Alford in his testimony. So I think this is a subject of active dispute. I do, in the interest of time, want to thank all the witnesses who've testified here today, and look forward to further hearings with the chairman.
Thank you, Senator Coons. And I'd like to go back briefly to Mr. Mayor. In your written testimony, you said that the science behind climate change and its effect on minority communities, quote, should not be up for debate. I'm curious, is the Sierra Club, is this a frequent practice to declare areas of science not up for debate, not up for consideration of what the evidence and data show?
If you are relying on the evidence and data, you know, the science, the preponderance of the evidence are there.
But that's a different thing than saying we should not debate a question, that the Sierra Club has declared this scientific issue resolved and there should be no debate.
Based upon the preponderance of the evidence, the science is settled, but the thing is that anything is up for debate, Senator. We can debate anything.
Well, you know, I would note that even the phrase preponderance of the evidence, having been a practicing lawyer for many years, means 51%. That means 49, at least 51% is what the preponderance means. You know, I would ask, for example, if you want to end debate, you don't want to address the facts, how do you address the fact that in the last 18 years, the satellite data show no demonstrable warming whatsoever?
Sir, I would rely upon the Union of Concerned Scientists, and I would rely upon the evidence, and again, from our own NOAA officials. The data are there.
Is it correct that the satellite data over the last 18 years demonstrate no significant warming?
No.
How is it incorrect?
Based upon our experts, it's been refuted long ago, and there's no longer, it's not up for scientific debate.
I'm curious if, I want to understand this. I do find it highly interesting that the president of the Sierra Club, when asked what the satellite data demonstrate about warming, apparently is relying on staff. So it's just a mistake. The nice thing about the satellite data is these are objective numbers.
Correct.
And the numbers over the last 18 years, are you familiar with the phrase the pause?
The answer is yes, and essentially we rest on our position.
And to what you said, you are familiar with the pause, so to what does the phrase the pause refer? I'm sorry, you said you were familiar with that term, so I asked to what does it refer?
Essentially, it's a slowing in global warming during the 40s, sir.
During the 40s. Is it not the term that global warming alarmists have used to explain the inconvenient truth, to use a phrase popularized by former Vice President Al Gore, that the satellite data over the last 18 years demonstrate no significant warming whatsoever? Global warming alarmists call that the pause because the computer models say there should be dramatic warming, and yet the actual satellites taking the measurement don't show any significant warming.
But, Senator, 97% of the scientists concur and agree that there is global warming and anthropogenic impact with regards to global.
The problem with that statistic that gets cited a lot is it's based on one bogus study. And indeed, your response, I would point that your response is quite striking. I asked about the science and the evidence, the actual data. We have satellites. They're measuring temperature. That should be relevant. And your answer was, pay no attention to your lying eyes and the numbers that the satellites show. Instead, listen to the scientists who are receiving massive grants who tell us, do not debate the science.
Sir, this is one of the national pastimes in America, and while we're debating what 97% of scientists have already settled, the 3% that we, as I say, have invested in with regards to the carbon industry, you know, our planet is cooking and heating up and warming. So this is one of the reasons why.
So hold on a second. It is the Sierra Club's position that right now, the Earth is cooking up and heating and warming. Is that the Sierra Club's? I mean, I just want to quote you and understand.
I am saying I concur with 97% of the world's scientists with regards to global warming and the anthropogenic effects of mankind with regards to climate.
But sir, would you answer the question? Is it the Sierra Club's position, as you just testified, that the Earth is cooking up and heating and warming right now? Is that the Sierra Club's position?
Global temperatures are on the rise, sir.
And I assume the Sierra Club would issue a public retraction if confronted with the facts that the data are precisely as I described, that over the last 18 years, there has been no significant warming, and indeed, that is why global warming alarmists invented the term the pause to explain what they call the pause in global warming, because the data demonstrate what you just said, that the Earth is cooking and warming is not backed up by the data.
We are concurring with 97% of the scientists that absolutely say the opposite, sir.
So if the data are contrary to your testimony, would the Sierra Club issue a retraction?
Sir, we concur with the 97% scientific consensus with regards to global warming.
I'd like to repeat, certainly in a moment, but I'd like to repeat the question and get an answer. If the data are contrary to your testimony, would the Sierra Club issue a retraction?
We concur with 97% of the scientists that believe that the anthropogenic impacts of mankind with regards to global warming are true.
So does that mean you're not willing to answer the question?
We can concur with the preponderance of the evidence and the science at 97%. You're asking me if we take the 3% over the 97%?
No, I'm actually not asking about a survey among scientists. I'm asking about the objective data, the numbers.
The scientists rely upon their objective data and their analysis, and 97% have concurred and conclude that global warming is indeed a fact.
You know, Mr. Meyer, I find it striking that for a public policy organization that purports to focus exclusively on environmental issues, that you're not willing to tell this committee that you would issue a retraction if your testimony is objectively false under scientific data. That undermines the credibility of any organization if you will persist in a political position regardless of what the science shows, regardless of the facts, regardless of the evidence, and regardless of the data. That is not consistent, I would suggest, with sound public policy.
Sir, you can pick whatever, choose and cherry pick whatever data you wish, but I concur with the 97% of scientists who concur that global warming is a fact.
Senator Cruz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just simply wanted to observe that we have a broadly representative and qualified group of folks who were brought here to talk about overregulation and its impact on minority communities. And I don't speak for the Sierra Club, obviously, but it is my hope and expectation that if you want to pursue that line of inquiry with them further, they'd be happy to. But my assumption is that we will continue to focus on the subject of the hearing at hand.
And I certainly concur with Senator Coons, and I would note that Mr. Mayer's written testimony and oral testimony focused in significant part on the Obama administration's new global warming regulations that could cost up to 10 million jobs, impose massive costs on American consumers. And so he argued that the data support causing millions of Americans to lose their jobs, including millions of African Americans and Hispanics. And I was pressing on what the data was that he was testifying about. And I would note that is not only relevant to his testimony, it was almost the entire subject of his testimony. And yet, apparently, the testimony is not based on the data or the evidence, or he is not prepared to discuss the data or evidence beyond asserting that we should take the word, to take their word for it. With that, I want to thank all the witnesses for being here. Thank you for joining us. We will be keeping the hearing record open for an additional 5 business days, which means the record will be closed at the end of the business day on Tuesday, October 13th, 2015. Thank you very much to each of the witnesses. The hearing is adjourned.
Thank you. All righty.